My name is Shalonda Spencer. I am the Executive Director of WCAPS, which is Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. We are a nonprofit organization. Our headquarters is located here in Washington, D.C. And first, I want to say thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedule and day to welcome us into your lunch hour, because it's actually lunch over here in the U.S. And just to let you know, like, we're an organization that believe in advancing women of color in the field of peace and security. We have over 13 working groups and almost like 10 chapters from across the U.S. If you are not a member of WCAPS, I always encourage you to become a member and sign up on our website, which gives you a plethora of information about who we are and what we do. Again, thank you for being here, and I'm very excited for this conversation. I am actually in the middle of my HQ strategy meeting right now, so I'm going to hop off and I'm going to hand it back over to Gabby. But I just wanted to come in and speak to you all and say hello, and now leave it over to Megan.
Thanks so much, Shalonda. And hi, everyone. I'm Megan O'Donnell. I'm Assistant Director for Gender at the Center for Global Development. And I've been so excited to collaborate with WCAPS colleagues over the past year on this event series that we do together. We've been able to touch on issues of racial and gender diversity and inclusion at USAID. We've had conversations about recommendations for the Biden-Harris administration. We've been able to connect early career professionals and students with development and foreign policy experts. And now we're here today for the conversation I think I'm most excited about, which is going to focus on localization in international development. We've got a really fantastic group of speakers, many of whom I've been learning from for many years, and will be able to offer their expertise and insights on localization from a number of different vantage points, whether that's on locally driven data collection efforts to advance policymaking, or research, or advocacy campaigns, or program implementation. And they'll all be able to shed honest light on some of the barriers that we encounter in realizing locally driven development. So without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah Buhush, who will be moderating today's session as a WCAPS member. Hi, Sarah, and over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Shalonda and Megan, for this great introduction. I am super excited and honored to be moderating this discussion today. Thank you to all of you who are joining from many parts of the world to attend this event. Before we start, some quick housekeeping. Please feel free to talk in the chat. We'd love to see you all engaging in the discussion. And if you have specific questions to any of the panelists, please mention to whom it is directed towards. We will also use the chat box on our side to share with you important links. Please keep your microphone off, but feel free to share your camera. We'd love to see your smiles. If you have not yet, you can visit our WCAPS website and the CGD website, which are both shared in the comment box. And throughout this event, feel free to post or tweet on social media, tagging WCAPSnet and CGDev. All right, this event is recorded and will be available later on YouTube, and the conversation will last an hour and a half. And before I introduce our great panelists, we have a fantastic panelist today. I would like to thank my colleagues, Daniette Moges, Gabrielle Gay, and Lola from WCAPS International Development Working Group, as well as Lara Biona and Jocelyn Estes from CGD, who all have put great efforts in organizing this event. Today, we are joined by esteemed panelists in the international development field, and I am happy to start by introducing Dr. Rose Oranger, who will open up the event with a presentation. Dr. Rose Oranger is the Director of Public Policy and Communication at the African Institute for Development Policy, AFIDEP. She is a development policy and communication specialist with over 10 years experience in development research to policy communications and in conducting policy analysis research. Rose has extensive experience in conducting analysis of policies and policy environments and translating and communicating research to policymakers and other general audiences, including the mass media. She also has extensive experience in designing and delivering capacity building programs in knowledge translation, including research to policy communications, but also research utilization by policymakers, media practitioners, and civil society. At AFIDEP, Rose provides strategic leadership in the design and delivery of evidence uptake research and interventions. Her publications have focused mainly on the areas of health policymaking and research to policy in the health sector. Dr. Rose will discuss today the challenges that researchers and policymakers in low and middle income countries face in accessing research stuck behind paywalls, and what can be done to ensure research findings are made more accessible in this context. I'm very honored to have you on board today with us, Dr. Rose. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. So I'll go straight to just share some observations and experiences that researchers, particularly in Southern institutions, face. And I've decided to use slides because I wanted to be more organized in my thoughts, and slides help me do that. So I'll just focus on the challenges, but of course noting that the issue of research and access to it is bigger than and its use is bigger than just accessing. And of course, just recognizing that it's very well acknowledged globally that research is critical for development, and that recognition is perhaps more important for LMIC contexts where we have quite limited resources. And so more important for us to ensure that we are investing our resources in the areas that have most need, or we are adopting interventions that are most effective to speak to our challenges. And we can't do that without using research. And so while scholars and leaders and funders globally continue to call for increased use of evidence for better decision-making and for more effective programming, we acknowledge that there are so many challenges that hinder sustained use of research in decision-making, and which eventually then affect the effectiveness of development efforts in many parts in LMICs. Some of these challenges have to do with a limited access to research funding for LMIC researchers, and that is really not the focus of my talk today, but I thought I should mention it, that LMIC researchers often have quite limited access to funding for them to even conduct the research. But my focus today is really on limited access to research, and specifically peer-reviewed scientific research. So generally, global research dissemination, the way it's set up is not working for LMIC stakeholders, and those will be people in government agencies, researchers, CSOs, people in the media, and other development actors. This is not working because scientific research is mainly disseminated through journals and databases that people have to pay for, you have to subscribe for, and subscription fees are usually very high. And on the other hand, where this is accessible through open access journals, then the researcher, the authors have to pay the journals, and the fees that one has to pay are actually high and are not affordable by many researchers based in LMIC context. In terms of numbers, actually 70% of scientific peer-reviewed research is locked behind a paywall. And so only 30% is actually accessible to a lot of stakeholders in LMIC context. And so the issue here is that disseminating research has been commercialized, such that the people who are actually reaping the benefits of these are not necessarily the people who are investing in the generation of research, who are investing in the writing up, and even in the peer reviewing. So while all these are done by researchers, and funding sometimes, most times actually come from public sources, and peer reviewing is free of charge done by researchers themselves, then accessing the final findings that come out of that, one has to access through commercial publishers who then reap a lot of benefits out of this. And yet research should indeed be a public good. And so what I'm saying is that the current research publishing model is actually undermining development efforts, because then it is hindering access and reference to evidence that is so important for a wide range of actors who are trying to put together programs or use innovations to speak to development challenges. I'll use this slide just to drive home the fact that lack of access to research is a real problem in LMICs. And speaking here from Nairobi, and the institution where I work, AFIDEP, we do a lot of work with African governments, other development actors, CSOs, media, and we face this challenge on a day-to-day basis where you can see a good abstract, you can see that there's some useful information, but you can't access this because it's behind a paywall, and your institution or even individually not able to access to afford the subscription fees. Sometimes, actually, in many cases, some government departments we've worked with have actually come to us and said, "Can you support us to, pay for these fees that we need to be able to access some of this research?" And so it's a real challenge that hinders drawing on some of the insights, some of the innovation, some of the knowledge that comes out of publicly funded research, and yet accessing this innovation and these findings becomes very hard. Of course, I've talked about the fact that LMIC stakeholders can neither afford this, but I think the important point to make on this slide is the fact that is the question that I keep asking myself: is it even ethical to conduct research in LMICs, but for this research to be inaccessible to LMIC communities? Because sometimes much of this research is actually research that is conducted here in our context, but then it becomes so inaccessible because it's hidden behind paywalls. And that is a question I keep asking myself: is that even an ethical thing for us to be doing? I want to note that there are some reforms. Of course, urgent reforms are needed, bigger reforms, to ensure that research results are widely and openly accessible so that they can benefit ongoing development efforts in different contexts of LMICs. There's also need for reforms that address the distorted markets, where those who are actually making profits out of commercialization of research are not the people who are even investing in the generation, in the writing up, in the peer review of this research. And then, of course, those reforms also address the missed development opportunities, which we are missing because we don't have access to existing research and innovation that is hidden behind paywalls. There are, yes, some ongoing efforts to address the problem. There are some groups, particularly in Europe, that have formed a Plan S through the Coalition S, and this is just a platform to ensure that research is readily available as soon as it comes out in open access platforms. And this is mostly research that is funded by public funds, so maybe coming from government or bilateral funders, so that this research is available. I guess the challenge with this is that even this effort in itself, the Coalition S platform, as you look at it, you realize that LMIC voices are quite absent in those ongoing efforts. And what that means that these efforts, while they're good, they will likely produce a solution that will not, or may further actually marginalize LMIC stakeholders, particularly those involved already in publishing themselves, because they're not currently part of these conversations to make research widely accessible. So some of the things that are needed in terms of the different stakeholders need to address this problem. I propose some ideas here, but I know the opportunities for more solutions and other ideas. But I think that research funders need to bring LMIC stakeholders in the center of the ongoing efforts to open up, make research more accessible. And I'm giving that example because I know that Coalition S efforts are going on, but LMIC actors are actually absent. There's need to invest in alternative publishing platforms, especially those that are led by LMIC stakeholders. And while there are efforts also to have fee waivers, to waive fees for institutions and individuals in LMICs to access some of these journals, that is a good thing, but it doesn't address the root cause of this problem. And so there's need to do much more, but also look at funding research and opening up research as a foundational development initiative, and not just a way that something that you'll say will do something small by waiving fees just to make it accessible, because the problem is much bigger than just waiving fees. For researchers, there's need for them to be deliberate in choosing where to publish, because some of the journals that are really top journals where they want to publish, they need to think at these open access journals. So not just considering the top journals, but also thinking about accessibility. If I put my research results in this particular journal, which is a top journal, will they be accessible by the communities, the context, the policymakers in where I work? They also need to identify ways of supporting Southern publishing systems, because these systems are actually there. They're journals in Southern contexts, but often these are not the most popular journals where a lot of researchers want to publish. So are there ways that researchers in this context can also be very deliberate in identifying and supporting Southern publishing systems? And then finally, the need to support moves that are moves that are there to cancel subscriptions and instead invest some of these monies in alternative models of publishing. So again, the need for Southern researchers or researchers in LMIC context to join these moves and just have their voice heard as well. So I'll stop there, but just to acknowledge that much of the content that is shared in this blog in this presentation is pulled out of a blog that was co-authored by colleagues Tom Drake and John Hall, and we also got feedback from Becca when we were writing these blogs, so just to recognize that some of the thoughts here are things that we discussed and conversed over time with these colleagues as part of writing the blog. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rose, for this great presentation. Very insightful, very interesting. You raise key issues here, definitely. You mentioned something very quickly about funding research, and it was very quick, but it is one of a key issue, definitely. But on the other aspect of the access to publishing platforms and the issue of having to pay to access for the edition and publishing, that is a key issue that we're finding a lot for low to middle income countries, stakeholders. I'm very interested by the solutions that the potential solutions that you are raising, including one where I would love to hear a little bit more on the Coalition S and other platforms that exist, the networks, and give maybe a little bit more insight about the Coalition S and what it is, what they're doing, and how it could well give some insight on what could be done elsewhere.
Yeah, so Coalition X is a fairly new initiative that was started by funding organizations, largely in Europe, and I think some of them are from the US. But the idea is to have a requirement that all research that is funded, that is produced using public funds, so funds from governments, the likes of USAID or FCDO, but funding from government, which are basically taxes, from citizens, that kind of research, all of it must be published in open access platforms, but also it must be published immediately. So it shouldn't be embargoed or delayed for any reason, so that this kind of information is readily accessible to everyone who is keen to use it in their development efforts across the globe. Now, the conversations actually started in 2018. And so far 2020 is the time when the initiative is now starting to implement that, even though I think progress is quite slow. And also they have now invited other interested actors or groups or publishing agencies, that particularly the ones in developing countries or LMIC context, to also join that platform. And so it's a new initiative. I can't say that the impacts are already being seen out of that. It's only just starting in terms of implementation. And we hope that maybe in the next couple of years, we'll see some difference, coming across to address this challenge. I guess the other bigger issue there is how do we effectively bring Southern voices centrally in that initiative, given that even where it has started is really started from the West. And when you look at some of the major players, they're the players from the West, although it's opened up and they've invited other stakeholders interested to join that coalition for that. And so it's a useful initiative, but still has some way to go in terms of implementing and benefiting benefiting or rather addressing the problem that I've talked about.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Rose, I'm reading my name. Thank you, Rose. I would just retain one sentence that you have said that struck me. Research should be a public good. That's what I will keep in mind, and that is basically the message that you are sharing, and I appreciate that. I would like to read a couple of comments that have been shared in the comment box. Someone is saying, Mamadou Falilo, unfortunately, I don't see the full name, so apologies. Dr. Rose, you are so right on accessing research papers. I used to rely on friends at international universities to have access to academic articles. So that states the issue. And there is a question for you. What are your thoughts on reforming universities that prepare development practitioners so that emphasize localization? But before you answer to that question, I would like to ask you one question so that we set the framework of this discussion, which is, what does localization means to you? And what are the challenges in meaningfully implementing localization in international development today for you? So yeah, if you have an answer to that, which is a big question, and perhaps answering to Amina Noor on her question.
Yes, I guess I'll start with the question and maybe come back, link back to the question of Amina. What does localization mean to me? So for me, localization means that key, or rather all development actors take ownership of their development, of their own development, but also not just take ownership, but drive those efforts. And development partners, particularly those who often come with a lot of resources, they fit within, they support and facilitate, local actors to own and drive their own development. And I'm saying that I think the big point there is that localization, I don't imagine and look at localization as something that should be done by one person. It should be done by both parties, both the ones who are keen on development, but also the supporters. So, and I'm saying that to challenge the fact that sometimes localization is seen as something that some people will come and do to us, but it's really about, can we own our own development agenda? Can we define what that is? Can we drive that is? If you want to help us, then you come and fit within that and support that, rather than not challenge, but also not change the priorities of a given country or a given stakeholder. So that's what localization means to me. If I may go to the second bit, which was about the challenges with implementing localization. So there are many challenges, but I'll mention just in the interest of time. One of them is the fact that we are not looking at localization in a holistic way. So it goes back to, how are we defining localization? How are we looking at it? Is it holistic, or are we being superficial? And I'm saying that because there are a lot of conversations going on localization, on decolonization, and sometimes it feels like they're quite, we want to scratch the surface, but not address the root cause. And for me, I think as long as we are not looking at localization holistically and looking at what is the problem, what are we trying to address? It's about power, right? It's about ideologies. It's about some narratives that have been created around some context and they have been accepted. So until we look at it holistically and come to the root of it, efforts that are looking at scratching the surface will not address it. And I think that becomes a bigger issue with implementation, because what are we implementing? Are we implementing the real issues that will address the problem, or are we just scratching the surface and having a nice name of localization? And of course, there are a lot of power issues there. Are there genuine efforts to do this? If it's about power, who is relinquishing power? Who is getting power? Are those relinquishing power genuinely keen to let that power go, right? So those I would say maybe conceptual issues, as long as they're still not being addressed, then whatever it is we are implementing is likely to fail. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rose. Do you want to take a minute to reply to the
Yes.
question in the comment box?
Yeah, so Amina says, what are your thoughts on reforming universities that prepare development practitioners so they emphasize localization? They emphasize localization. I think one of the conversations and one of the work that I've been involved in has been thinking about not just universities, but even just the education systems in our contexts, right? So the whole education system from the early career, primary, high school, and then university. There is, I think, a big issue there, right? And academia in universities can play a big role even in reforming education systems, so that these systems are speaking to the context. There are systems that are teaching people to be proud of who they are, systems that are teaching people to know that we have solutions that have worked over many years, and we don't have to be looking outside to find solutions. So there is a bigger thing in reforming education system, and that would include universities, for instance. So looking at even some of the degree programs that are offered in the universities, are those driven by the needs within a country, within a context? Are those driven by addressing the local problems? Are they just degrees that are offered because other universities offer these degrees? So I think there is a bigger role for universities to play in terms of reforming even the degree programs, the training programs they offer, focusing more on programs that would drive development, and that should be development the way we understand it, or development that would actually address our problems, and not development the way somebody else understands it. But then also some of the top minds within those universities, can they drive reforms in our education systems, all through from the nursery to all through the system, so those can be contextualized to actually speak to addressing our problems.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you for this great presentation that opened the floor for the panel discussion now. Thank you for being present and for joining us. I know you have to leave, but it was really a pleasure to have you around and to participate in this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
All
for
right.
having me.
Thank you. For those of you who are joining us as we will start our round of questions with the panelists, I encourage you all to use the Q&A function. We will have dedicated time for questions at the end of the panel discussion that I will take from the audience later on. All right, I am very excited to present our first panelist, Commissioner Jamila White. Jamila White is a principal at Black Equity and commissioner at Washington, D.C. She is a racial equity and justice disruptor and global community development expert and advocate that works with organizations, businesses, and individuals. Raised in Virginia and Southeast Washington, D.C., Jamila comes from a long line of powerful, trailblazing women who instilled in her a deeply rooted commitment to community service and social justice. Values, often learned right around her grandmother's kitchen table. Jamila's work and impact cross borders and focuses on collaborative ways to ensure Black people at home and abroad have agency and power over their lives. Previously working in Africa and the Caribbean for over a decade, Jamila is currently a small business owner. Her firm, Black Equity, tackles wealth and equity gaps in Black and Brown communities by bringing funding, investment, partnership, and developmental resources together in sustainable ways. Jamila is a trusted advisor serving the community in various leadership positions and programs, including currently as an elected member of Washington, D.C.'s Advisory Neighborhood Commission, and serving as the co-founder of the Geraldine and Coleman, a seat at the kitchen table, College Scholarship Fund. From her work to her community commitments, Jamila's life is guided by an underlying belief that all people deserve a dignified life, and she has dedicated her life to achieving that goal. All right, that's an impressive bio, that's an impressive profile. I'm very happy to have you, Jamila, with us. Our second panelist is Lauren Rawlings. She is the Director, Economic Growth of Palladium. She is also a DC native. and she has been in international development for 20 years and has worked for 2 large USAID implementing partners, a large multilateral DFI, and small local organizations. Since 2008, Lauren has worked as a consultant, largely supporting efforts to drive more inclusive access to resources, skills, and entrepreneurship. She has developed partnerships between multilateral organizations, foundations, investors, and private sector actors to achieve positive social and economic impact. She is now an executive responsible for developing new businesses, designing and leading projects, testing new approaches to doing development differently, and entering continuous learning and improvement. I told you we had a fantastic panelist. And last but not least, I am very happy to introduce Frida Gituku. She is the Executive Director of Goose Kenya, a national movement of grassroots women and girls. Frida spends her time mentoring grassroots women to leadership, powering grassroots women feminist organizations, and amplifying their voices. She is also a passionate promoter of the roots, saving and cooperative society and grassroots women-only financial institutions. I'm very happy to have you all here today. Thank you so much for joining. All right, I will start with the panel discussion and raising the questions. So given the conversation that we had in the presentation from Dr. Rose, I would like to start with hearing about, from your experience, based on your experience and where you sit now, what are the top 3 challenges in meaningfully implementing localization in international development today for each one of you? Who wants to start with that question? Okay, all right, go ahead.
Hi, first a big thank you to WCAPS and CGD for convening this discussion. It's a perennial but also timely topic, so thanks a lot. So I understand localization as part of a larger agenda of justice and self-determination for people in previously colonized and otherwise exploited countries, right? So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And this conversation, right, has surfaced approaches that run the gamut, right? From, ending aid to shifting, thinking about aid to more of not assistance because we're kind, but reparation, right? A reparations type framework, right? So restoring and repairing past wrongs and abuses and exploitation to, right, these things, this thinking about how to make our current aid more effective, right? And so there's a whole gamut of things, and some of that is part of the decolonizing aid agenda. Some folks, want to think about some different language for that, but that's generally the construct there. So what I'll say is that the discussion of localization sort of assumes that we've put aside, at least for the sake of this conversation, the idea of ending aid, right? But I will say, I think it's worth engaging folks who believe in ending aid, right? There are folks who believe that, making arguments from the left and from the right, and they have important points to make about what's wrong with aid. And I think engaging with those points and engaging that thinking can support folks who are trying to do aid differently and do aid better. Localization could be, right, a relevant topic in thinking about designing delivery, design and delivery, I should say, of reparations type aid framework. But for this conversation, so my remarks though will largely be around the current aid construct and, so the aid effectiveness and bringing more justice to aid. So that said, there are many barriers to localization. And so I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to talk about 3 categories, right, of barriers. And it seems to me there are several kind of structural, sort of meta systemic problems with localizing aid, right? If you think about in the US aid context, right, there's simply the reality that US aid is part of the US foreign policy institution, right? And so what makes sense for the United States is important, right? And that's those, the agenda setters, the people who develop the budget, design strategies, they're very much thinking about US foreign policy and US security, right? So hard to get around that reality. There's also domestic politics, right? In a polarized society like ours, and you see this what's happening in the UK with DFID funding and DFID and merging into FCO, is that, you know, there's domestic political concerns, right? And very often one of the arguments and the political arguments, one of the justifications that proponents of healthy aid budgets give is that it creates jobs here at home. It hired, you know, we support businesses here, right? That's another reality that the proponents of robust, generous aid are struggling with, that there are lots of people who do not believe in aid at the small poultry level we have today, let alone more generous programs, right? So that's sort of some of the, and then there's the power imbalances, right? There simply is the geopolitical reality of, you know, the donor countries and the recipient countries and the power of the purse, right? So those are some of the, I would say, kind of structural barriers. There's also administrative barriers, right? So that has to do with, again, even beyond USAID, US government procurement requirements and US government contract management requirements, right? There are some things that USAID, even if they completely wanted to, would have to negotiate with, you know, Defense Department and the administrative arm of the United States government, right? And so that is, that's a problem. But I would say what USAID can control is the fact that they have lately made their contracts and their project budgets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that means it's that much harder if you are a large, well-resourced organization. It is very difficult to bid on those at all, let alone successfully. And, you know, in addition to, you know, this being a barrier to localization, frankly, USAID struggles to meet its small business contracting, right? So US small businesses struggle to get business at the rate that US and Congress say this should be the portion of contracting budget that goes to small businesses. They keep making these contracts bigger and bigger and bigger. They think that's going to be effective and efficient. I have some observations that potentially don't support that, but that's sort of where it's been going lately, right? And then there's a human level, right? Kind of, let's be honest, right? There are human prejudices and biases, right? About what expertise is and looks like, right? Who is trustworthy, right? Who can be trusted with money? Who can be trusted? And a lot of that, you know, kind of that colonial hangover that we know best. We in the West know best, right? So those are some, but what I will say is at the personal level, that's at least where there's some short-term opportunities, right? So even though I'm working in this construct and I have lots and lots of barriers and lots of hurdles in terms of trying to localize at least the work that I have, that I own, right? Since luckily I have a bit of positional power now, you know, I get to run parts of, you know, a portfolio. And so I have my own localization agenda, right? But I am always pushing against, let's be honest, I'm pushing against the standard way of doing business of my company, USAID's standard ways of doing it and expectations. And frankly, even expectations of the partners, you know, especially those who've been involved with USAID before, aren't quite used to me saying, no, you tell me the answer, right? So positioning myself as a thought partner and the USAID whisperer, right? So I've said, look, I am, you know, here to be a thought partner. Clearly, you know, there has to be some accountability. So I do that part for my employer, but I really make sure that at least where I have my locus of control, I'm very much pushing, you know, broader decolonization agenda and certainly localization as part of that. So let me stop there. I know I've said quite a mouthful, but I'll stop there and happy to answer questions later.
Thanks so much, Lauren, for this comprehensive answer. And building upon your answer, actually, I would like to ask someone like either Jamila or Frida, if you have any thought on my next question, which is bilateral donors often refer to often prefer traditional partners. I would like to unpack that, especially on regarding what Lauren has been talking about. What does traditional mean to you in a sense? And also, why do many of the standards in our sector center around westernized nations, and what are the policy, programming, and personal implication to it? And perhaps how we can push against it and foster real localization. Who wants to take this?
I will.
Okay.
Thank you, Sarah, and all the panelists. GROOT has been in the localization agenda for 26 years. In fact, the organization was established as a means of delivering on localization. So for us, localization is about investing more in areas or in people who experience poverty the most and where development happens. And it's also about recognizing the power, the agency, and the contribution of those people, meaning you see them as active participants in development. And this is a process that results to strong organization, better delivery mechanism, achieving value for money, but it's also more cost effective. And I like what Lauren said, especially around perception as attitude. As an organization working with the many grassroots group, we have around 5,000 grassroots group across the country that we work with. We see that the perception that we development actors have on grassroots women, local community, is that they are beneficiary. We even call them that in the development world. They are beneficiaries, they are target of development, but they are not. These are experts. These are people who have their own contribution. They articulated their own problem and they define their own solution, but we come in and proclaim that power over them in things that they already used to solve for their own. And that's a big challenge in localization. Of course, also the failure to recognize institutions that are established by communities themselves. Our definition of what organizations are is also very flawed. And the moment we refuse to recognize collectives as established by local communities, whether formal or informal, whether groups or NGO, then we are undermining their agency. And of course, it means we perceive them that as they're not adequate enough to enter into partnership. And you know that rolls into funding, contracting, and investment. And the kind of partnership model that we continue to advance is one that is built on capitalistic and very patriarchal ideology. I think we as activists have a responsibility to disrupt that. And I know this is also part of the effort. It is exciting to see in the review of the Beijing Plus 25 that there is a commitment to push more funding to feminist and grassroots organizations. But that said, as a local organization, I see what donors consider to be traditional partners are those who are already in their system, and so they do not pose a huge risk, quote unquote, to their funding. It's those institutions that are established in the country of their origin. So if it is the European Union, it's institutions that are either established in, in Netherlands, in Italy, in Rome, those that form the European Union, or those that are led by people who identify with their identity. Of course, organizations that are also established top-down, because in most cases they are seen and perceived to be more fitting within what we define as the corporate governance structure, and the structure that they think guarantee most accountability, which is a lie, because we are still globally and locally dealing with corruption, even when we've tried to fit development institution into that corporate governance structure. And accountability is about passion, it's about values, it's about ethics, and it's about people commitment to transformation. It is less about the structures that we put together. Increasingly, I've also seen that funders and partners will establish own institutions at national level. And those are the preferred partners for them. Unfortunately, even institution is not established, it's not homegrown. It's not established by the locals who are dealing with that organization. Even if it is registered in Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, it remains a foreign institution. Politically and in terms of diplomacy, people may not voice it. But the fact that it is not homegrown, it's not owned by the people whose problem you're trying to, to advance, to solve. It doesn't make it a local organization. So those are the traditional institutions that I see a lot of partners investing in. Unfortunately, what has resulted, the consequences is that we find ourselves in a development crisis where we are constantly implementing funding partners log frame. We are domesticating international policies, even when they do not apply in local context, or we do it blindly to the local context. And we design program with the capacity of people the expert who do not live in the context that we are trying to improve. We also constantly find ourselves in what we call the project traps. We are moving from one project to the other, but transformation is brought about by building movement, by investing long-term, by being in that course for the long term and being patient. So this idea of developing new projects every 1 year, every 2 years, it will not bring about transformation, and it hasn't. And so the development cooperation must be designed completely different and must go over and beyond project. Projects and programs must be seen as a means to deliver, but it should also not be the barrier why we are not achieving the transformation that we seek. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Frida. Thanks a lot for your response. I agree with what you said, and I would like to add that on top of moving from one project to another, and from 1 year to another, like short-term projects, there is also the issue, and you mentioned it earlier, the fact that it's expat staff, is one staff from another to another, one team to another, one organization to another that hands over to another. And the key thing about localization is actually to, and I like the way Dr. Rose has talked about it, is giving ownership to the organization, the grassroots organization, that they lead the efforts and that the international actors actually fit into the local and national organization agenda and not the other way around. So thank you so much, Frida. And Jamila, maybe you want to answer that question too.
I'll just be really brief and additive on what Frida said. I think even if you look at those organizations, it's primarily white-led organizations who are the traditional donors. And it's racism and systems of dominance and oppression that is keeping us the way that we are. We know that 98% of funding goes to international organizations that are primarily white-led. We know that roughly 50 to 60% of that funding comes back to the host, to the giving organization, like Lauren said, and less than 2% of funding actually goes to local organizations. So is a whole industrial system. There's a complex around international development. So I come from the angle, I want to be very clear, of decolonization. And I can tell you what decolonization is to me in 5 key areas. So it's recognize the damage that has been done, repair through reparations, restoration and repatriation to pre-colonialistic times, redistribution of power, and reimagining the world that we need to live in. And so that's another, we can kind of go into my 5R model, but I want, very clear that it's systems of oppression, dominance, and racism. When we look at what's happening in our own country, in the country, the power, in the racism that's happening in their countries, we cannot blindly be blind to that and say that this is not exported and not seen within the work that we do. And so throughout my career, I have fought against and kind of been a very vocal advocate until actually last year when we saw the gruesome murder of George Floyd. And I saw all of these international organizations putting out Black Lives Matter statements, and I was offended. I had to take 2 weeks off of work because I was disgusted, because I looked at those organizations and I knew that they did not have any Black people at all in leadership positions. And I knew from working it, because I worked a lot of places, y'all, from the NGOs to everything. I spent the first 10 years on a continent. But I knew that they were not pushing a pro-Black agenda internally. And I knew that, you know, when your goal is we need to go to $100 million next year, we need to be $1 billion in 10 years, you're not concerned about Black people and their lives and them having agency and power. You're concerned about your budget and your bottom dollar. I was personally in meetings where I've had a CEO tell us, this is at a development agency, hey, I need to send my kids are entering college next year. We need to make all of our bonuses. I think I give a damn about your kids entering college? And I said that in the meeting. How racist are you? You hear that? And so, okay, sorry guys, I was going on a tangent. I'm not gonna go on a tangent today. So I would be very clear about, you know, what it is and call it out for what it is. And we gotta be clear. International organizations, international nonprofits, international contractors, the gamut, self-preservation is involved. And is not actually wanting to give up their own power and their own stance and looking at things through a completely different lens. It is a shame. It is a crime on humanity. It is a violation of Article 3 of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights for decisions to be made in Washington, D.C. on K Street about the lives of Africans. Where is the justice in that? I'm not even talking about localization. You do this project after I've already designed it. When we need to ask ourselves, why are we here in the first place? Why are you even here? And is the reason you're here, most likely the root cause of it is either the colonization and the genocide of indigenous people or the enslavement, torture, and rape of indigenous people for capitalistic gain and Eurocentric exploration and continued perpetuation. And look at how it translates into neocolonialism today. We see it in our trade agreements. We see it in our international power structures. So why are we here is the question. And are we here to, like it's been said before, to continue to promote US or national interests, wherever the money is coming from, which is probably not in the interest of your country, nor the interest of the Black people or people of color in their country? Because we're fighting against those same racist policies right over here. And that's the reason I quit international development. I ran for office and I said, to hell with this. I'm starting an international racial justice organization where I'm going to fund grassroots activists because enough was enough. And I don't believe in reforming the system that's broken. I believe in reimagining how we want to live. I believe in reparations where you pay back what was taken, not only 400 years ago, but the exploitation that has continued. And so we have a reckoning within ourselves. And let me just tell you a little research I did. So all of those organizations that was putting out Black Lives Matter statements, I teamed up with some beautiful Black women and we did our research project. We went to 25 of those organizations that got the most USAID money out of any, out of all USAID money. They got the most, like, you know, almost over $1 billion a year. And we did an analysis on their leadership structure to see how many people in leadership and in their board were people of color. We broke that down by race as much as we could. And I don't believe in race, but we can talk about that later. And then we also did the same for the board. Do you know that less than 5 to 8% were people of color? And that's across the board. And this was pre some hirings that happened in 2020. Do you know there was not a single Black person as a CEO of those top 25 organizations that get the most USAID public dollars funding? Only 2 of those CEOs were of color. So we gotta be real with ourselves about it. Like, who controls the money has the power. And the money is being controlled by one group, primarily one racial group of individuals, so that they can continue to have power and privilege that the rest of us don't get to enjoy. I'm sorry if that was a little much, but.
Please don't be sorry. That was great. I can't read everything that is in the comment box, but there are a lot of comments on your intervention and also the previous ones, but definitely, yes, amen to everything that you said, and linking it to decolonizing ed and to not only ed, but reparation, actually. And I think that someone has written it, actually, not ed, but reparation. So that is actually very, very true and very insightful. I'm gonna give the floor to anyone else who wants to jump back very quickly to what Jamila has said. If not, I will move to the next question. we're running a little bit out of time. Lauren, Frida, do you want to jump back? Yeah, Lauren.
I was gonna, just because there was a button in the chat and something, the importance of language, right? And so, Frida mentioned, beneficiaries and like saying, but that's not actually the right language, right? Because it does inform how we think about people, right? And that there is expertise, right? We're trying to, if we are honest, if we mean it when we say, right, we are there to support, right, economic justice for previously exploited and currently exploited communities. And by that we mean they should have lives of health and safety and prosperity, and they should thrive. Why would I, sitting here in Washington, be the one to say what it means for a woman in Burkina Faso or a teenager in the Philippines to thrive? And yes. I get to measure that, right? And so, though, those are our experts, those are our partners, those are our clients. They are not, inert beneficiaries. We are coming along in our grand benevolence and sprinkling some money and some capacity on these, sort of inert communities, right? These are human beings with a fine-tuned understanding, like we all have, of our lived experience and our aspirations for our lives and our children's lives, right? So, urge anybody, get rid of beneficiaries and all the mindset that goes along with that, right? So depending on how I'm engaging with communities, they are my clients, right? So the way I talk about it, the way I've got my teams talking about it, USAID is the donor / funder, right? But I am there, those, because the high level development objectives sometimes actually make a lot of sense. I'm saying, okay, but the people we're talking about in that development objective are not the people in Washington and people at USAID. So I'm going to take this seriously, that you are paying me to do X, Y, and Z. So those are my clients, those are my partners, those are the experts that are going to inform the work, inform design of the work, be leading the implementation of the work, right? That's what it's going to mean, right? So, beneficiaries, no, those are my clients, those are my thought partners. Sometimes there's stakeholders that can be a little bit, in my opinion, wishy-washy, right? Because you're not saying what the engagement is, right? We often have a tendency in development to say, we're going to consult local stakeholders to get their buy-in. That means you're selling them something, right? You have not come to have a conversation. You've come to make a sales pitch about what you've decided to do. And that is not, that's not the way to do this, right? You've got to go and have a conversation. They have to have decision-making power, right? They've got to have real agency. They've got to, and more have control over the resources. Jamila, I couldn't, put it more clearly. It's about power. Who has the power? Who's unwilling to give up the power, right? Who's going to get the power? And if we are not willing, and people like myself, right? I, as a Black woman in the United States, I've got a whole bunch of, struggles and isms to combat. But I'm very clear that in my professional life, I am very much part of the privileged class. And I know I have to be willing to work myself out of a job if I'm really going to be living my values, right? That's what it means. Not thinking, oh, I'm going to set up a little consulting firm to compete with Palladium and I'm in business. No, right? Black people in the United States, right? Deciding they're going to act just like the current donors is not the answer, right? I have got to be aligned with my sisters and brothers. That's how I think about them and say, what can I do for them to have my place of power, right? For me, that's what we're talking about.
Okay, wow. I love this
Can I add
discussion.
something?
Yeah, Frida, go ahead.
Of course, if you look at the institutional framework, what we are told are development organizations or institutions that should model what development is and how development should be delivered. We are looking at the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and all those. Look at how those institutions are constructed on bureaucracy, power asymmetry, Black tokenism, and they are just designed to exclude those who are experiencing poverty the most. How then can we trust those kind of institutions to deliver change or even justice? The institutional framework is completely chaotic, And it's really a lot of hard work to deconstruct that. But I think it's also a path as activists we really have to stay on if we are to deliver on this.
All right. Well, I have a question that will strike another controversial conversation, I guess. So basically, oftentimes, international development organization, aka traditional partners for large donors like USAID, actually find themselves evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of local organizations and making decisions on how they will contribute to solving issues in their own contexts. So, of course, there is the question of a foreign organization evaluating local organization on their capacity to evaluate their own context, but there is also my question on how does one measure the social capital of an organization, and most importantly, a local organization? And how do you build a companionship, I would say, more than capacity building? I'm not really sure how to frame it, but I think a companionship could perhaps be a word to ensure that there is this improvement in capacity, or yeah, that's very difficult to use the words like that. But yeah, does anyone of you want to answer that question?
I have a little bit to say. So I'll start backwards with the issue of capacity, which you're obviously, tripping over and stumbling with. We had a little bit of chat about what it means, what capacity is, who has it, how we define it, right? One of the things I tell my partners is that, a big, and I think I mentioned a little bit before, a big part of my value add and my capacity is I understand USAID and use me for that, right? And one of the, in terms of what's important, very often, understanding the local and social and political context, technical expertise, are important, but I would say equally important and sometimes more important to win and to be successful with USAID is understanding USAID, right? How they talk, deciphering their USAIDs, like that is incredibly important, right, for USAID. And so that's not something a grassroots organization, right, working in, in many places will understand, and frankly, why should they? And so that's one of the things I see myself as bringing to the table. So I can be the USAID whisperer. I will help make sure that USAID can digest, appreciate, understand what you're bringing to the table. And I will also make sure I share that capacity, right, that skill for understanding USAID. That's something I have to share. But really, again, sitting as outsiders, being the ones to judge who's going to it's bounded by so many, kind of structural problems, right? So if you're talking about Americans working at USAID, you're going to go in a local context, you want to find someone who speaks English, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times, I see job descriptions for someone who's going to be working in a Francophone country or in a non-English speaking country, and English is a requirement. And, I have to keep taking it out and say, why? You do not need to speak English to be a chief of party in Burkina Faso, right? And so there's a bias towards Western education, right? There's a certain set of things, in addition to the content of the education, right? There's a certain way you learn to package yourself, and so you're legible to Westerners. And I think, and that's a part of the problem as well, right? Folks aren't able, to recognize talent and skill if it doesn't come packaged, right, in the way they're used to seeing. They're not willing to do the work to see the expertise. And so it's not legible to Westerners, to folks with the power, right? And so folks who want to be, who have some power and be in this fight have to really do the hard work. In terms of how you would more appropriately gauge who has the right kind of social capital to affect things, it's actually really doing the work. Right now, unfortunately, organizations like USAID are not patient, and you get on the ground and 3 months later, you need a quarterly report is due, right? What have you learned or seen in 3 months, right? Not a whole lot of substance yet, right? Unless you live in that community and work in that community your whole life, right? But you have to go into the communities and be quiet, ask a few questions and listen, see what small organizations are actually having an impact, right? I think one of the problems, one of the things we really get tripped up when we talk about, who's going to be able to be an effective partner, is that we confuse scale with impact, right? Like a lot of big organizations, USAID, World Bank, they like big numbers, right? So the fact that you churned 20,000 people through a training program, kudos, right? To what extent did that change anyone's life, right? I would rather, look at a community and say, we worked with this community and, 90% of those people, right, were able to have a significant, meaningful 20%, let's say, right, increase in their household income. As opposed to saying, and so maybe you're like 500 people are significantly better off, as opposed to saying I was able to touch, a much larger number. And so one of the things I think we need to push for is really rethinking targets and how we define impact, right? I'm really struggling with counting reach, right, as opposed to meaningful impact in communities, because that's how you're going to change the power. When people actually, their lives are meaningfully transformed and they have more time to engage. So I'm going to stop there. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to stop there. But yeah, because this is a topic we could all go on for much longer.
Thank you, Laura. And definitely we could continue very long on this topic. Yeah, Frida, I see that you're on mute. Do you want to add? We have just a little bit of time to finish before I hand over.
I will add two very brief points. One,
sure,
is that international and foreign identity is not positively correlated to capacity, and you cannot claim to evaluate people who have even more expertise than you. I think a lot of effort should be put or transferred to co-creating solutions and in participatory monitoring for impact, not so that you can evaluate my success or failure as an implementer. The other thing is that social capital cannot be measured through the traditional research methodologies. We really have to think out of the box. We have to appreciate the stories that Indigenous people are telling us in their local language and put effort to listen to their emotions, to their stories, and to their passion. That's how we are going to measure the transformation in those communities.
I'll build off very quickly something that Frida and Lauren both said. So our current way of looking at monitoring and evaluation or capacity building is just completely messed up. I mean, the first are the indicators developed by what makes Congress happy. And I'm focusing on very US context and what makes them happy and what makes them feel good. It's not based on what is actually change and impact and transformation. So what we're even measuring does a lot of times does not measure what success looks like in their community. Never is it going to a community and saying, what does success look like to you in a water program? Or if you could imagine this $5 million water program, what would your community look like? And like what Frida said, you start through imagination and building a story. Because when you build a story that tells a community's vision and future, you will then see how the community measures that. And then you can put that in a language your donor needs to say, no, this is how we measure. But the reason it's not like that is because if we were to do that, we would put power in the community's hands. And in this current model, it's not meant to have power into the community's hands. And I want to be very real about that, because that requires intentionality. And we're not being intentional about the work that we're doing. And so if the indicators are written for white Western norms and what appeals to their society and culture and what's respectable to them, some of these words there's no equivalent in local languages. We can't even translate the concept because it doesn't exist. And so I feel like we try often is to say, hey, we're going to try to shine you up and make you look palatable and respectable to white people. And like, it's mind-boggling to me. And so how do you actually measure impact is through giving the power to the people and letting them tell their own story and figuring out how we use our power and our privileges to make that story come true. And then that's how we measure the success based on what they're doing. And, we have to be very honest. It's not a money issue. In my opinion, we don't have a resource issue in terms of funding. You look at countries like a Liberia, for instance, that has a population of 4 million people, but has more than $100 billion of funding coming in it through a year. You can't tell me you can't get reparations out. Like, that's impossible to say that. Like, literally everybody could go from 5,000 a year GDP to 50,000 overnight and their lives will change. Even just 1 year experiment, and to sit back and see what happens and let people do self-determination. And then, we also want to come, especially with the whole carrot and stick dangling, our form of democracy, which is unjust and built on racism, but our form of democracy, and say, hey, you can have our money if you do this form of democracy, which people know it's already unjust and know it's unequitable and uninclusive. When you say you have the freedom to vote, but then, after you vote, we're going to take your voting rights from you, that's democracy and justice. Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you. Tell me how to vote. So we got to be very real with ourselves and what it is that we're pushing and whose agenda and who it's for. So just to be honest, it's for, white Western dominance. So of course, anything that's going to come out of that lens is going to be for that. Now, where there is a lot of opportunity and influence that can happen is in philanthropic dollars, because you don't have that same attachment to government dollars, and philanthropic dollars can be used to start helping to drive more justice while we work on like the overall behemoth of the government. And I would love to, we can have a separate conversation about how to drive more justice using philanthropic dollars and using private sector, the way that private sector relates. I think partnerships is huge. We got to get proximate. Those closest to the problems should be closest to the solutions. They should be who should be at the decision table? First person is whoever's impacted. Whoever has to live every single day with whatever you're trying to do should be the first person there. So, Frida, you're on mute. Oh, I'm not sure if you're talking, but I'll stop.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for your great answers. I'm gonna jump. I'm supposed to move to the questions from the audience, but please be with us. We might have 5 to 10 minutes. We might be 5 to 10 minutes late. This conversation is so great. So if you don't mind, we'll stay a little bit longer for the questions from the audience. But I'm gonna pick up a comment that has been shared in the comment box by WCAPS actually. Random thought. I often think about the reason international development exists. Is it simply an extension of colonialism? If so, then localization is irrelevant, because the true purpose is not to improve conditions for any nation, and it certainly wouldn't be a priority to rope in local actors. Just a thought. I would like to have maybe just one person to answer to that, but I will reshuffle a bit the question. I'd like to hear about, because for me, localization, I hear that from the organization, from the agencies and so on, is the agenda, the big agenda. No one is actually talking about decolonizing ed. And I wonder if localization is just the nice word to hide behind a reality, and localization is just, hey, we're going to work with local organization, which is actually not going into the root cause of the issue, and questioning the history, questioning why we are in this situation today, why the countries that we are supposed to help and communities that we are supposed to help are in these situations. So if someone wants to really quickly comment on that, and why the organization are so focused on localization and not talking about the real issues, racism, etc.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick parallel similar to the one that Jamila made, right? It's much more, I would say folks who have power and are currently, in the power seat, get most of the money and resources, they often treat localization the way a lot of folks in the US who don't want to do the hard work treat diversity, right? It's tokenism, right? So it looks nice. Oh, we gave this much of the contract to these folks, right? Usually they're local elites, right? You may or may not even get to a real grassroots organization. So it's another problem. Which locals are we talking about, right? And I like Frida framing it and saying, when we mean localization, it's having people closest to the problem, not just somebody else in Kenya, right? So what I will say is too often the easy thing to do, the way people say, oh, let me put a brown face up in there. If you don't change power, right? And maybe you get a brown person that can affect a little change, but we need things that are going to disrupt how power currently works. And so localization has got to be about power there, not just subcontracting to local organizations, which is, like an empty diversity seat.
Yeah, and transferring all the risks, etc., to local organization, basically. Okay, well, I'm super excited. We had a great conversation. I loved hearing you all. We're going to pass to the questions from the audience, and there's quite a lot of comments and questions in the comment box. So please forgive me if I miss some, but I will go with a question from Siobhan Owaso Nawe. Apologies if I misspelled. Why must reparations always be a sales pitch? Has the right to life been so disregarded that we shouldn't even expect the simple guarantee of agency and the right to the most basic amenities available to everybody else? I think we mostly have replied to that question. But if someone wants to jump in.
One word answer is racism, right? People don't actually value Black and brown lives. Racism, that's why we have to, what's in it for you? We've got to start to pitch. Oh, well, reparations would be an economic stimulus program. I understand the pragmatism of making those arguments, but absolutely, Siobhan, it's about justice. Period.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. That reparations were paid to white terrorists who enslaved Africans after the Emancipation Declaration. So the U.S. does have a history of paying reparations. They felt that it was unjust for those Southern farmers to lose their property because Black people were not human. So it can be done. It has been done in the past. There's a history of reparations, but like Lauren said, it's a justice issue that's deeply rooted in racism, and particularly anti-Black racism.
All right, next question in the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box. It will be easier for me. The first question is for Dr. Rose, but I apologize as she has left. So I'll move to the next one. In what ways might grounded theory lend itself to helping solve this problem with research and localization? That's also for Dr. Rose, so I will move to the next one. Okay, that one is for Lauren. Thanks for taking the example of USAID to back your argument. I really appreciate. What do you think about the staffing of foreign aid agencies in the road to localization when we realize that the most important positions are reserved to foreign staff, even though they might have less expertise than the national staff they supervise? I think that we have covered that, but yeah. Sorry, I'm reading the questions while with you, actually. To all panelists, how could the Biden administration be leveraged as a political opportunity, building on the momentum brought about by the BLM movement and the new administration move for more equity to advance the agenda of localization? Jamila, I see you laughing.
I have a few words to say, but I'd love to hear from Jamila on this one.
Yeah, me too.
So look, I think the Biden administration does represent some opportunities. Are we going to see transformation and disruption of the fundamental power structure? No, right? I can't imagine that. I'd love to be wrong. Please, President Biden, prove me wrong. Right? But there are some opportunities, right? There are some things, and one of the things I'm looking to get involved in doing increasingly is, pushing them to adopt some of the more progressive domestic economic policy, right? And do that in their foreign aid, right? So they're slowly looking at things like baby bonds, right? Slowly looking at thinking about how we do care work. So there are some elements, thinking about, where is the earned income tax credit like a unconditional cash transfer. So there's some opportunities to make some incremental change. And look, people are suffering, so that's better than not doing it, not taking up the opportunity. So I think there's some opportunities for some incremental change, but that means folks still need to be beating the drum, the transformation. So I think it's both. I think we take the opportunities that we have, and we still are really, really loud, right, about a need for structural change.
Yeah, I think Lauren summed it up perfectly in the best way I could say it.
Okay, great. Fantastic. I'll move to the next question then. And please, everyone, use the Q&A again. That makes my life so easier. The next question is, what are some practical tools, tips to implement localization agenda, meaning that you have to know how to resist the oppressive agenda? I'm thinking particularly about people working at country offices who are very much under pressure to keep good relationships with their global north offices, and I would add global north offices and donors. Big question.
That is a big question. And so I'll try to look at this in two parts. So one, there is a lot of power in the people at the local level. One of the examples I'll look at is what happened in Kenya several years ago, when Kenya as a government said you will no longer have these huge pay disparities between foreign expat workers and national workers, and they forced international organizations to reconcile the pay scales. And I'm not saying that didn't force a whole bunch of other economic issues or anything like that. I'm just using that as a very, very tiny example of how there is a lot of work and connectivity that can be done in country around civil society advocacy, especially in this age of advocacy right now, and seeing how you all can join up with more social justice advocates that have been advocating for social justice for years in your country to take this on as an issue. And so outside of kind of that civil justice advocacy, one, don't do anything don't take on any kind of risk that you feel is going to bring unsafety to you. And so I say that because when you do start going against the system, there will be repercussions. I'm not even going to lie about that. A lot of people will toot the Black Lives Matter or say diversity, equity, and inclusion, but when you hold them to it and start to ask for change, it's this level of fear that comes in. And not fear of change, I don't think, but it's the fear of loss. What Lauren said, well, if we do this, then that means I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to lose this, and not seeing what they will gain, because we will all gain when white supremacy ends. And so, and I say that because to shape the work that you're doing, because if you are going to go kind of against the system and call for more leadership, more equity, pay equity between expats and national staff, or even asking why does expats need to be here in the first place? Why can't we, and I'm saying not necessarily from USAID, but from a nonprofit or private sector standpoint in country offices, why do we even need an expat in the first place? Like, that will cause discomfort in decision makers, and knowing that taking on a social justice cause is not easy work. It's courageous work that has to be done, but building yourself up to be prepared for that. So making sure you have a tribe and a network and a community that supports you, making sure that you got a plan B for if that ship is not ready to start turning a little bit, and then making sure that you're taking care of yourself as well, and that you're continuing to put wellness into you so that you don't burn out from this work that you're trying to do. And so I know it wasn't like a magic bullet to say, how can we force organizations? But I think also the last thing I would say, one of the things that we worked at of a previous employer, we were trying to do, and it kind of came organically, we started connecting more with our employee affinity groups from the national office to our country office. It started to make those partnerships so that those working in the national office could be an advocate and a voice for those working in the head office, working in a national office, and take some of that risk for them and be a shared partner and to be an accomplice and a co-conspirator. So there are those opportunities. You can find your co-conspirators within halls of power, working with them to push these issues. And there was a lot of, in that one experience, we fought on behalf of national staff in a lot of instances, whether it was employment, HR issues, most of it was HR issues actually that came to another power and equity issue. So.
Yeah, can I add something?
Yes, sure, please.
Of course, I don't work for an international organization, so I will respond in the international, in the local context. And for us, how we've challenged that system as groups is, first of all, to call out the problem and being bold. We once had a very brutal fight with the World Bank. They even reported us to the Minister of Finance. Luckily, our own government took our side because it was about how we are implementing the saving and lending model at the local level. They were pushing us to implement the model as defined internationally, but we knew better because we are working with these communities and they are giving regular feedback. We know what works and what doesn't work. And of course, the risk was that we would lose the partnership, but for us, we were willing to lose to gain in the future and in the long term, but also to, you know, to balance those power relations. So you have to be bold and call out the problem and be aware of the risks that comes with that, and of course try and mitigate them, especially the personal risk. The other one is also to shift the kind of partnerships that we negotiate. So increasingly, we are trying to pursue partnerships with what we call feminist donors who are agile and flexible, who are interested in investing in our agenda and not forcing groups to fit in their global strategy. I think that is doable. It's not a one-off shift, but increasingly as a local institution, you can shift toward those kind of partnerships. The other thing, of course, is to build the political consciousness of your peers. Groups as a women's rights organization, every time we reflect in the Kenyan women movement space, and you will see that a lot of women's rights organizations in Kenya do not take money from USAID, not because we have a lot of money, because it's a political statement that we've collectively decided to push back. So there are those small actions that collectively and increasingly can make impact.
Can I speak up on one word that that Frida used, which is bold, right? And she talked about it in the context of the organization, saying they'd be willing to lose funding over over a stance they believe, right? And that's, I think that's important also individually, right? To be bold and to be brave enough, right? To stand in your principles and your values. And obviously, as Julia said, you got to keep yourself safe, right? Make sure you keep yourself safe. And certainly when you're early in your career, you have fewer degrees of freedom. But when you get to pretty senior, frankly, the more senior you are, the more complicit you are if you are not pushing back, right? And so, you're sometimes going to have some difficult and unpleasant, sometimes awkward conversations. Do them intentionally and know what the risks are, right? And so that's where I am, right? I'm like, yes, I know exactly what the full set of risks are, potentially even in some of the parts of this recorded conversation. And I'm very aware of that. I'm also very clear of who I am and how I want to live my life. And to, especially now that I can somewhat afford it, not have to make all decisions about careerism. Again, for me, this kind of career only makes sense if I'm figuring out how I can make sure somebody can take over my power seat. Then I can feel somewhat justified in the way this power works. But I can say, how can I get somebody else in this seat?
Yeah. And Jamila has just written in the comment box, find your power brokers who can be co-conspirators. That's very true. And as you said, Frida, is about being bold. In your country, that's something that is possible now because there is some history, there is some organization and structures within the grassroots organization. In other countries, it might seem a little bit more complex. What I would say is that I would remind the organization that the international actors and agencies need the local organization. And that is where the power imbalance can be balanced back. They need these organizations, not the other way around. So that is very important to keep that in mind. And also by structuring, as just like in Kenya, like structuring, having some structurations and cooperations, coordination between local and grassroots organizations, so that you have, because when we're in groups, it's more easy to push back and to have power and to use that power. So clearly having some cooperation and working together, that I have noticed that is very powerful as well. Okay, well, I'll move to the next question. And we'll end up, as I said, please be with us. We'll stay 5 or 10 minutes more. The next question is, what do we have? All right. Moving back towards the issue of beneficiaries, stakeholders, how can we revisit the issue of funding, of finding funding, providing resources for NGO and independent researchers without stakeholders expecting to see more than simple philanthropic altruistic donations / paying it back? How can we hold people accountable, EEIE, I don't know how to say, people not in the public eye, for acts of corruption / embezzlement / criminal injustice, that's a lot of / when we can't leverage the power of the public? That's a long question, but not sure to have understood it all. But basically what Siobhan Owasonawe is saying is, how do we, and if I understand well, how do we revisit the issue of finding the funding without stakeholders expecting to see philanthropic or doing philanthropic or just altruistic donation? So that's an interesting question, but I think there is not much that we can do and that's the issue of the donors and yeah, I would say that comes from the philanthropists and donors issue, that we have to challenge the narrative. Do you have anything else to say to that question? It's just the narrative that is actually problematic.
I think as I understood it, one of the things that I work with here, mainly in the US, I work a lot with philanthropic donors now, is getting them to revisit the way they do philanthropy. And in order to change the way they do the philanthropy, you have to change the way in which you partner with organizations in which you see as a partnership. Oftentimes in this society, we're taught like win-win, I have to get over on you. It's not like we both win, it's I have to get something and you just have to get a little bit less. And so what we talk about is changing how you partner, creating new tools and new products for local organizations and grassroots organizations. Like maybe your requirements are non-inclusive. Maybe they're racist requirements, just quite frankly, and you need to revisit that and how to do that. And so it's continuing, like you said, Ansara, to push that advocacy, but also bring about real solutions on how organizations, philanthropic organizations and other organizations can transform themselves to be able to be racial equity and anti-racist organizations. And I'll say, you know, to be very honest, like when we kind of look at this industry, it's looking at not necessarily like what role do we want to have and what role should we have. And, you know, I don't think it's necessarily saying that, you know, nonprofits aren't going to exist anymore or Palladium's not going to exist anymore. Sorry to just say Palladium out there, but just the only firm I could think of. It's understanding it's not that you're not going to exist anymore, but the way in which you partner and the way in which you exist will be dramatically different. So yeah, you're working yourself out of the type of job you have now because we're creating a new equitable relationship. So it may be that you're not doing, you know, development work, but we're trading partners. We're business to business service providers. We're, you know, value chain, you know, we're part of a same value chain or supplier of this, and looking at the way that we actually relate and how we're going to work together when there isn't that mass suffering, when we actually have equity and can come up to even playing field. So,
and I see that in the chat, someone suggesting that the question may be also internal accountability and corruption. And you know, the way when I think about localization.
But very quickly, Lauren, sorry to cut you because we just have 5 minutes, and I would like to finish with a question. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying, you know, some of that is just, you know, it doesn't have to be through government, right? I mean, again, go directly to the grassroots organizations doing the work in the communities you care about. It doesn't have to be through government. So, you know, sometimes that's the best way to get around concerns about corruption. And so I'll leave it there.
Very true. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, I'll take just 2 last questions. One is blah, blah, blah. Yes, can you please speak to specific ways that philanthropic donors can engage with local organizations directly, and how to identify this organization without in-country presence, etc., rather than granting to traditional organizations? I think that's an interesting question. Maybe Jamila or Frida, if you want to answer.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I think that if you don't have a presence in country, then the first thing to do is work through the diaspora community. The diaspora community in whichever country that you're operating out of, there are very strong diaspora communities all over the world. We know that diaspora usually contributes more in GDP than foreign aid if you take out of military and defense spending. So there's huge diaspora communities right there in the countries that you're working in. There's an organization called Diaspora in Action that was started by Rashida Peterson, where she's identified, it's a fund where diaspora funds development projects in the countries in which they're coming from in Africa and the Caribbean, where there's no middleman. You're going directly to grassroots and nonprofit organizations to support them for efforts. So it's thinking about it through a mutual, more like a mutual aid approach, which is global solidarity, not charity, meaning that we know the benefits of everyone. We know that we know that it's not only our responsibility, but it's going to benefit us as well. We're all going to gain. It's enough resources for us all to eat in this world. And so my main recommendation is looking through that diaspora that exists and starting there if you have no connections otherwise. And then the Diaspora in Action is an organization that focuses on the Caribbean and Africa.
The Global Fund for Women identify grassroots organizations. They're based in California. They have no offices established in Kenya, but they identify grassroots organizations through a referral mechanism. So if you're endorsed, if you're endorsed and recommended by an institution that is doing transformative work in your country, they have the faith and they trust that that recommendation is in itself enough for them to invest in that institution. And they've grown a whole community of grassroots organizations that they work with. So I think also that is another pathway.
And sorry to interrupt you earlier, Frida. I was just going to say Rashida is a vice president at the Global Fund for Women. So it's all doing that social justice. And it goes back to Global Fund for Women supports women's social justice movements around the world. And if you get involved in the social justice movement, you will find partners. You can do that as well.
Yes.
All right, let's move to the last question and then we can wrap up this great discussion. Someone has written, the UK government is currently accepting evidence to inform its new international development strategy. What are some key points that the speakers would emphasize to strengthen localization in practice going forward for the UK government? Any advice? Frida, go ahead.
First thing, they need to stop channeling resources to the Global South through private companies or the so-called funding agencies, because those funding agencies are, they are constituted by people who come from the market, the capitalist market. So the ideal that they actually import into this space are purely capitalistic. And it's so chaotic the way they are managing the grants in Africa. That is something they need to eliminate in their structure.
Okay. All right. I wish I could continue this discussion for hours. I feel like we could continue to discuss and discuss and discuss. And I see a lot of comments in the comment box and questions, but I will wrap up here. I would like to thank you, all of you, Jamila, Lauren, Frida, and Dr. Rose, for this great discussion and for your very great insights and comments today. Thank you to everyone for joining this conversation, for being so active in the discussion in the comment box and in the Q&A and sharing your questions, etc. We really loved reading you. And thank you to WCAPS and CGD for organizing this event. We hope to have more on this topic and others, and please feel free to check the websites and to connect with us on social media and to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much. Have a great evening or day, depending on where you are. And yeah, bye.